Hello, welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and I invite you to episode 60 of season 2. And we are at the dawn of the reign of Krishnadevaraya. Every king who has made a larger-than-life stamp on history attracts legends. We've all heard the stories, tales that range from the absolutely fantastic to the almost believable. And about Krishnadevaraya, there were many. At least a dozen stories of how he came to the throne and how he managed to avoid terrible fates on the path to kingship. These stories were rather large, but the message in the tales was clear. He was the chosen one. I will bring you some of these stories, the tall tales and the legends about him, but more importantly, a measure of the man in his basic human avatar. This episode is the first in a multi-part series on the reign of Krishnadevaraya, who ruled his empire Vijayanagara at the zenith of its glory. We are in 1509, the year that Krishnadeva became king, but more importantly, we will talk about this century, which was marked by events that changed the course of world history. Events that directly or indirectly impact our lives to this day. And let's jump in with all that. But as soon as you allow me a moment to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose corporate support makes this podcast possible. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. It was around July in the year 1509. The monsoons would have set in. Those streets that had been cobbled would have been clean, washed by the rain, as would have been the walls of the fortresses and the temples. It would have looked and smelt like a new dawn. And that, in every sense, was what it was. In the bazaars and the porticos of court, people would have spoken with excitement in hushed tones. A new king had taken the throne, and the man being crowned was not the expected or even the rightful heir, but he was not unknown either. Krishnadeva was not a young man when he became king. He was already 38 years old. He was born around 1471 to Narasimha, the powerful regent of the Saluva king, and Krishnadeva's half-brother Vijayanagara was the first of the Tuluva rulers. At the current time in which we are, Vijayanagara had just died 2 weeks before. If you believe the legends, the country was back to that bad succession drama that had plagued the Vijayanagara rulers for the past several generations. And now there was drama with Krishnadeva, and the stories ran wild. Take this gruesome legend that found its way into the writing of Fernão Nunes. It goes like this. When the ruling king Vijayanagara was on his deathbed, he summoned the prime minister, one Saluva Timma, also known as Timmarasa, to his bedside. He told Timmarasa that after he died, he wanted his 8-year-old son to be crowned king. But there was a problem. His half-brother Krishnadeva, he didn't trust him. So he ordered Timmarasa to blind Krishnadeva, put his eyes out. Tasked with this wretched assignment, Timmarasa met Krishnadeva secretly in the horse stables. He told him what he had been ordered to do. Hearing this, Krishnadeva responded that he certainly didn't want to be blinded, but at the same time, he had harbored no desire to be king, even if convention allowed him a legitimate claim to the throne. He told Timmarasa that he did not want any position in the empire and that all he wanted was to live his life out as a yogi. Timmarasa weighed his options. He was not happy about crowning an 8-year-old boy. Besides, he was impressed by Krishnadeva's dignity and tact in responding to this life threat. So Timmarasa made up his mind. He called for a goat to be slaughtered, and then he plucked the eyes of the goat, took it out, and took it to Vijayanagara as proof that Krishnadeva had been blinded. Vijayanagara died, believing his own son would be king and that Krishnadeva could no longer be a threat to his line of succession. But as it turned out, Krishnadeva was not merely a threat, he became the succession by the hand of that patriotic Prime Minister, Timmarasa. Needless to say, this story bears all the signs of folklore and it has been disputed by scholars like Nilakanta Shastri, but like all folk tales, It showcases what the people saw in this king and how they spoke of him in the years to come. The relationship between Krishnadeva and Timarasa was a very special one, evidenced by the unusually high number of times that his name, Timarasa's name, appeared on inscriptions. In a later episode, more details about the ups and downs of this friendship. But for now, when Veeranarasimha died, Timarasa ensured that Krishnadeva assumed power in 1509. Krishnadeva's formal coronation took place several months later, on or after the 24th of January 1510, as recorded in an inscription at the Virupaksha temple in Hampi. The date referred to on the inscription is Magha Shukla Chatrudasi Shaka 1431, and that corresponds to 23rd or 24th January 1510 in the Julian calendar, or a month later by the Gregorian calendar that we use today. But Krishnadeva was now Krishnadevaraya, the emperor of Vijayanagara. That inscription at the Virupaksha temple actually recorded the construction of its great eastern Gopura. It is composed in a manner that was confident and stylized, but it said nothing of the struggle between the brothers. But this was a time of delicate transition, and the Saluva dynasty had vanished, the Tuluvas had seized the moment. But all said and done, the court needed reassurance that this new king would endure. As the son of Narasanayaka, who was never a royal, as we know from previous episodes, his sons, Veeranarasimha and Krishnadeva, would not have received the education and training that royal princes received. So, Krishnadeva had not been groomed for kingship. By that token, neither would have been his brother Veeranarasimha. But Krishnadeva understood power. He was a field commander. His authority came not from a bloodline, but much like Saluva Narasimha, from what he could hold and command. And in 1509, he began to command a great deal. But to grasp the weight of what he had inherited, one of course must begin with Vijayanagara, but not stop there, because what Krishnadeva was stepping into was much more than a throne. This was a moment in history when the whole world was changing all at once in Europe and in Asia. And while history is always a fluid tale, some periods do more than just turn the page. They change the script, and this was one of those periods. And to understand it, we must go beyond the Deccan. Rarely has there been a time in history, in India or in the wider world, when so many transformative events happened all at once. And each of these changes influenced what happened in Europe and Britain, of course, but by the consequences of colonization in India and the Deccan, eventually our lives to this day. So it merits a deep dive into looking into what the world was like as Krishnadeva took over the throne. Because the 16th century was a time of such cataclysmic change. And here's a taste of some of that. It was the time that Vasco da Gama landed in India, pugnacious and religiously proselytizing his faith. This was the century of the Protestant Reformation, a movement that would start with the English break from Rome and lead to the migration of dissenters, which led to the founding of the United States of America. Henry VIII took the English throne the same year that Krishnadeva became king of Vijayanagara. And it is towards the end of this century that we see the arrival of the East India Company into India. This was the time that the Delhi Sultanate had collapsed, defeated in the Battle of Panipat by a young Turk, and hence that expression. His name was Babur, the first of the Mughals. What a century it was! For us here, it begs a reflection on what Krishnadeva might have known or sensed about the world beyond his domain, of the events unfolding in distant Europe. What, we might ask, could he have known? Well, probably all of it. After all, his court received traders from Lisbon and Venice, envoys from Persia, caravans from Hormuz and Cairo. Among them were men like Portuguese chronicler Fernão Nunes, who would certainly have understood the battles that were being waged within the soul of Christendom. So it stands to reason that conversations in court or reports from travelers would well have reached Krishnadeva. News of a Catholic world in turmoil, its spiritual unity breaking, its monarchs defying popes, its merchants seeking new alliances. Krishnadeva, or anyone else really, may not have been able to assess the impact that these events would have on his own land, but the tremors of those distant conflicts, the tension between faith and empire, scripture and crown, were already influencing the men who had stepped onto his shores. Christian versus Muslim, Protestant versus Catholic, old enmities from Europe arrived with new ambitions carried to the shores of India. And now for a brief word from our sponsors, and when I return, we'll take a high view of that changing world to see what was unfolding beyond the horizon. We'll delve into the ideas of Martin Luther and John Calvin, the Protestant rebellion, and the Catholic response that fueled the Portuguese drive for empire, and how that affected us. We'll follow how these forces, theological, political, and commercial, crossed seas and entered the Deccan. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Many of the beliefs we hold, the nation in which we live, the cities we walk through, including Bangalore, trace their lines back to these very years 5 centuries ago. We are at the beginning of the 16th century, in the year 1509, as I said. This year, in Europe, marked a quiet storm. A young prince named Henry, the second son of a fragile Tudor dynasty, became King of England. Henry VIII was 18 years old, newly married to Catherine of Aragon, and nominally devoted to the Catholic Church. But he saw the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to her as untenable. One thing led to another, and Henry appointed himself as the Church of England and broke off all ties with papal Rome. This was in effect a Protestant state church, one that would maybe indirectly go on to foster the British ships to India, fund missionary activity, and construct churches like St. Mark's Cathedral in Bangalore. Henry's defiance was only one strand in the larger revolt against the Catholic order. In Germany, I should say in Saxony, a monk named Martin Luther began preaching against the selling of indulgences. That's payments made by the faithful in return for the church's forgiveness. It was a reasonably known Catholic practice. Luther's protest in 1517 when he nailed a manifesto titled The 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg would start a theological rebellion against the authority of the Pope, the sanctity of its tradition, and the economic greed of the clergy. Martin Luther argued that salvation came through faith alone, not from coins in a box. For those of my listeners who are interested in a deeper look at this, I would recommend reading A Supplication for the Beggars by Simon Fish, written in 1529. A Supplication for the Beggars was a highly influential, polemical tract. It was written during the early stages of the English Reformation. It was a fierce attack on the wealth and abuses of the clergy, specifically monks, friars, and other religious orders, whom Fish sarcastically refers to as these sturdy, idle, holy thieves and locusts. Fish, like other Protestants, did not like the materialism of Catholics. His book contains trenchant anti-Catholic emotions such as these lines which I quote now. 400 years ago, of all this they had not a penny. These locusts own also 1/3 of the land, or in all more than half of the substance of the realm. Fish argued that the excessive wealth of the Catholic Church impoverished the realm and its people and prevented the king from raising taxes for defense, and this led to widespread beggary. The 400 years ago comment refers to a time before the church had amassed such wealth, and that would have been around the 1st century AD. Anyway, the reason this is relevant to us is because the resulting militant Catholicism, trying to defend its domain, came to us in the form of Vasco da Gama and the establishment of the order on Indian shores. Speaking of Martin Luther's challenge nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Would Krishnadevaraya have remembered the tales from over 1,000 years before of how a Buddhist scholar in Talakadu, Mada Gajendra, posted a challenge of debate to Hindu scholars on the door of the palace of the Ganga king Harivarman? If you want to know more, I went over this in an earlier episode, part 2 of my series on the Gangas. Following Martin Luther, another reformer emerged in France called Jean Calvin, known famously as John Calvin. Calvin argued for a purified, more disciplined church free of hierarchy, icons, and papal authority. Together, Luther and Calvin cracked open the authority of the Catholic Church, and in doing so, they remade the West. But while Protestants were questioning papal power, Catholics were responding. The Portuguese crown, deeply Catholic and fiercely royalist, launched what came to be called an overseas crusade. Its warships carried both cannons and crosses. Merchants and missionaries sailed together now. The conquest of India was not only about spices and horses, it was, for many Portuguese, about saving souls. The zeal of Portugal's Estado da India, the Indian state, and their settlements in Goa were not merely commercial. They were also doctrinal and parochial. And this was the time that South India, Hindus and Sultanate Muslims included, would have received their first taste of institutional racism, defined not by birth and caste, but based on the color of one's skin. It becomes evident that it was the Portuguese who introduced into India the most explicit, institutionalized, skin color-based racism and racial science, and created a rigid hierarchy based primarily on perceived race and skin tone. And they implemented it in practice. For example, a weak example nonetheless, only a few decades after their arrival, say in 1541 in Goa, the Portuguese seminary set up for the training of native youth did not allow white and Eurasian students to enroll and mix about. These native students were ordained to perform service and spread the message to the non-white countries from the Middle to the Far East. The records show that by the mid-16th century, the school had enrolled 110 students, most of whom were Konkani speakers and Malayalis. There was a clutch of Marathis, Bengalis, Gujaratis, Chinese, and 5 boys from the Deccan Sultanates. In the introduction to a book by Charles Boxer, the scholar J.H. Plum wrote, and I quote a fragment, "The Portuguese were intensely racist. In Goa, even a native wet nurse was thought to contaminate an infant whom she suckled." No matter the power, pomp, and circumstance of the Vijayanagara kings, the new dimensions of racial divisions were getting firmly established rapidly right in the kingdom and right in their backyard. In this context, the voyages of Vasco da Gama appear more charged. His first arrival into India in 1498, when Krishnadeva was a young prince, was marked by confusion and cultural mismatch. The gifts that Vasco had brought to Calicut did not impress the king, the Zamorin, who did treat him with courtesy but gave him no importance. Vasco da Gama returned home insulted and bristling, and he came back in 1502, and this time he brought ships, guns, and a mandate to demand terms. By 1509, the very year that Krishnadeva took the throne, Portugal had begun to redefine the Indian Ocean. On the 3rd of February that year, in the port of Diu, north of Goa, near Gujarat, a Portuguese fleet led by Francisco de Almeida engaged in naval battle. The coalition of forces that faced the Portuguese included the Zamorin of Calicut, the Gujarat Sultan Muhammad Shah I, but importantly the Mamluks of Egypt, who had sent a naval fleet from near Suez. The Mamluks had been in war with the Portuguese at home, and this was an extension of their battle. This makeshift Egyptian Gujarati fleet, in the words of a historian, lost decisively to the Portuguese. But it was not merely a victory for the Portuguese, it was a warning. The Indian Ocean was no longer Indian except in name. And the Battle of Diu was one of those first naval battles in the Eastern Hemisphere to be won decisively by cannon fire at sea. This marked the growing supremacy of European naval warfare in Asian waters. The implications were not lost on those who traded or ruled along the coasts. Ports that once belonged to Gujarati, Arab or Deccan powers now faced a new kind of enemy, ones that arrived by sea. It was the scale of the Battle of Diu that was something new. The last time history meaningfully recorded a naval assault on the Konkani lands was in the early 7th century when Mangalesha Chalukya successfully attacked Goa or Revati Dvipa from the sea. There are more details in my earlier episode, The Chalukyas, Part 3. When Diu happened in February, Krishnadeva was not yet king. But he, like everyone else, relentlessly close to the coasts and dependent on the ports for their wealth, would have watched closely as the Portuguese asserted their naval might. Envoy spies and caravan leaders brought news with them, and what they likely told the kings was this: there was a new power on the sea. They brought horses and muskets. They spoke of gold, and they prayed with zeal. They were violent, well organized, and determined to control the ports. These were the new barbarians of the gate. The real story of the Battle of Diu is layered with many inset cause and effect stories. There had been attacks on Portuguese merchant fleets by the Sultanate's forces, and because the Portuguese had sided with Cochin over Calicut, they had poured fuel on the fire of a long enmity between the Deccan Sultanate and them. But this is a vast topic that has its own books. What effect did this have on the rulers? Krishnadeva, for one, decided to take the pragmatic route. He would go on to negotiate with the Portuguese, trading with them while refusing any particular political alliance. In the year 1509, all of that lay ahead of him. So too lay ahead the other great power that would rise in the subcontinent. From the mountains in the north in Afghanistan, a young warrior named Babur, the great-great-great-grandson of Timur, was trying to hold on to his kingdom. He had lost Samarkand, his ancestral capital. Later that decade, Babur would descend from the Khyber Pass and make repeated attacks starting in 1519 AD on the ruling Lodi Sultanate, who were already battling the long-domiciled Afghans. In 1526, Babur defeated the Lodis at Panipat and established the Mughal dynasty. His descendants would rule much of the subcontinents for 300 years. They would build the Red Fort, the Taj Mahal, and the administrative structures that the British would later absorb. If Krishnadeva was about to build the most dazzling empire of the southern Deccan, Babur was about to establish the most iconic one in the north. And in this moment, 1509, both men stood on the edge of greatness. And right here in Krishnadeva's own kingdom, another name was coming into the spotlight in this eventful century. A young man took over as chieftain of a small and rather insignificant province, Yalahanka. His name was Kempegowda. And like Krishnadeva, he understood that real power was not in armies, it was in roads, markets, and townships. And in a short while, he would be granted authority by Krishnadeva's successor, Achyuta, to found a new fortified settlement that he would call Bengaluru. This entire episode has been a look at where we are in 1509 AD, but the stories from all that, the empire, the city, the sea routes, the guns, the temples, and the gold, lies ahead of us in the upcoming episodes. And between doing the podcast and posting every day on my Instagram page and writing my book, I do my best to bring it all home as soon as I can, which I will. Until then, I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.